Good morning. I apologize in advance for my voice. I think the allergies have hit me. I want to welcome everyone this morning to this session with a former Woodrow Wilson scholar who is going to be presenting the results of his dissertation research to us. EJ, I never did know what the first initial stood for.
Ernst John.
What?
Ernst John.
Ernst John?
Which is why EJ.
You always go by EJ, right?
Yes.
Okay. EJ completed his doctoral work at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs. He was an OSI Africanist Doctoral Fellow here at the Wilson Center in 2006. And he has extensive working experience as an arms expert with the UN panel of experts on Sudan, and he had served for a period of time in Addis Ababa, and also he worked on Somalia when he was based in Nairobi, Kenya, investigating violations of the UN Security Council arms embargoes. And his dissertation analyzes the impact of these arms embargoes on internal conflict and the UN's role in ending or limiting violent conflict. So we're delighted to have you back at the center and look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I'd like to thank Dr. Wolpe and the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me to speak. And thank you also all to coming to this talk. And of course, I'm talking about the humanitarian impact of UN arms embargoes and whether arms embargoes can help end or at least limit violent conflict. And this is a topic of particular interest to me, both for I have worked with this issue for more than a decade, both for NGOs and, as Dr. Wolpe mentioned, for the UN. But I never really had the opportunity to test empirically whether or not arms embargoes have the impact they're supposed to have. So this presentation that I'm going to give to all of you is going to be roughly divided into 4 sections. First, I'll try to briefly describe why I believe arms embargoes are an important issue to work on. Secondly, I'll describe what I think are problems with current sanctions theory. Thirdly, I'll talk about the findings of my study. And lastly, I'll discuss briefly the policy implications of my findings. Thank you. The research that I did, just briefly, to give you a sense of what I tried to do, was both a statistical analysis and a case study, or in-depth case studies of a number of embargoed conflicts. The data that I analyzed was a data set of 125 civil conflicts since the end of World War II, and that data included a lot of socioeconomic and physical military variables that are thought to impact both the length and the violence of civil wars. Of course, I should note that this data is problematic from a research perspective, but at least I tried to do it as a first-order cut into the issue in a more empirical basis. And then I did in-depth research into 4 cases. They are Bosnia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Somalia, which obviously are all embargoed conflicts, but I argue vary along a number of different important variables, including when the embargo was imposed in the conflict cycle, the political importance of those countries to powerful states in the international system, how much monitoring and enforcement was present, also whether there was domestic production of arms and ammunition, which is an important loophole, obviously, for some conflicts, and lastly, whether they had access to valuable resources such as conflict diamonds that could be used to purchase weapons on the international black market. Now, why do arms embargoes matter? I would argue that arms embargoes are a popular policy choice because they're more forceful than mere diplomacy, but not as costly and risky as military intervention. Therefore, they're frequently the consensus choice of the Security Council when it comes to trying to deal with humanitarian crises. And since the end of the Cold War, they have become one of the main international tools to ostensibly help end civil conflict. So before the end of the Cold War, the international community had imposed 2 arms embargoes. Since then, there have been 20. In addition, the European community and the United States frequently also imposes arms embargoes in an attempt to try to alleviate humanitarian suffering in war-induced humanitarian crises. Now, for the study I did, I focused on UN arms embargoes solely intended to end or limit violent internal conflict. That doesn't mean that arms embargoes aren't imposed for other reasons, such as trying to end state support for terrorism or trying to influence states in other ways. It's just something that I felt I didn't need to deal with in this particular research project. I should also note that I make a very important distinction between what I call impartial or blanket arms embargoes that are imposed on all actors in a conflict and partial arms embargoes that are imposed only against one side to a conflict. Now, I would argue that arms embargoes can be important because, of course, ending conflict quickly could help save lives, save money, and also prevent lost development. Often wars are extremely destructive, both for the country in which the war is, of course, happening, but furthermore also for the region and the international community. Too frequently, wars spill over borders. There are obviously huge refugee flows. There's lost investment and trade. Furthermore, billions of dollars is spent on emergency humanitarian assistance, which is often diverted from long-term development projects, also obviously spent on peacekeeping operations and also for post-conflict reconstruction. So, for example, the war in Bosnia is estimated to have cost overall some $53.5 billion between 1992 and 1998 alone. Of that, the peacekeeping operation was estimated to have cost some $19 billion. Humanitarian operations cost another $12 billion, and the direct economic cost to Bosnia, both in lost trade and investment, and obviously in destroyed infrastructure, was estimated to be more than $15 billion. This, of course, does not include the unilateral cost in assistance or lost trade to individual countries, and does not include the expenses incurred since 1998. And as you well know, there is still a very large international presence, both military and political, in Bosnia as we talk. Part of the problem that I argue is, of course, that there's some rather ambiguous thinking within the international community about what exactly arms embargoes can achieve. Now, theoretically, there are a number of goals that the international community could try to achieve with an arms embargo. The minimum would be to try to contain a conflict, that is, to try to keep it from spreading beyond its borders. Bosnia is oftentimes suggested as a success in that it did prevent the war from spilling over beyond Bosnia to the wider Balkan region. Obviously, one of the things that people were quite concerned about was that Bosnia would again become the Balkan tinderbox that could spread or that could incite a regional war. Perhaps more ambitious is an attempt to try to deter or compel changes in state behavior or in non-state actors' behavior. Now, this, of course, is, or I would argue that this is an important distinction, of course, because compellence is generally more difficult than deterrence. But the problem, of course, is that advocates of arms embargoes often think that they're trying to deter behavior and thus underestimate the difficulty of changing that behavior. Of course, it's preferable to dissuade a state or a group from launching an action that would create a humanitarian crisis, but that's quite difficult. It's oftentimes very hard to predict whether or not some action is going to trigger a humanitarian crisis sufficiently far in advance for an arms embargo to have an impact. Furthermore, once a crisis has begun, the perpetrators may have already anticipated that an arms embargo is going to be imposed and decided that the arms embargo is not going to deter them from completing their project. Lastly, of course, leaders often face a very high political cost for reversing course once they've decided on a certain path of action. So that even in the case of trying to get an aggressor to halt a discretion, it's generally seen as compellence, that is, trying to change behavior rather than trying to deter behavior, since the deterrence has already failed to halt the aggression that it's trying to prevent or trying to change. Lastly, and perhaps, and what I would argue most ambitiously, oftentimes arms embargoes are imposed in an attempt to establish a peace. And of course, this is the most ambitious goal, but it's also the most difficult, since it is trying to influence combatants who are already locked in a life and death struggle, one in which they're heavily invested. Now, of course, the question is, what exactly is the international community trying to do when it imposes humanitarian arms embargoes? And as you can tell from the quotes that or from the citations that I present up there, it's usually some variation of for the purpose of establishing peace and stability in country X, Y, or Z. It certainly is the most cited goal, and it's probably the motivation for most members of the Security Council when they impose an arms embargo on an internal conflict. But I argue, of course, that it's quite difficult to influence a war with an arms embargo. In principle, because, as I mentioned before, what you're trying to do is you're trying to change the behavior of combatants who are locked in a life and death struggle and will do everything in their power to try to evade the arms embargo. Furthermore, even relatively small forces can destabilize very large areas. So, for example, the SLA in Darfur, which is really not a very large rebel movement, or at least it wasn't when it started, has resulted in a war that's created an estimated 400,000 deaths, another 4 million people displaced, and a humanitarian emergency costing hundreds of millions of dollars. This, of course, doesn't take into account the cost of both the AU and the UN mission that are now present in Darfur. Furthermore, there's also an abundance of small arms and light weapons in the region and obviously in the international community. So, for example, it's estimated that more than 50 to 70 million AK-47 assault rifles have been produced, and a significant portion of those are still in circulation. These weapons are extremely lethal and they're very easy to use, which is one of the reasons why you see the continued prevalence of child soldiers in many conflict areas. In addition, there are also widely available civilian equipment that significantly impact fighting in internal conflict. Cars and trucks expand the potential battlefield tremendously. One of the reasons that Darfur is such a huge conflict is because, as you can tell from the picture, rebels use trucks that they've modified for military purposes and can operate quite in a very mobile fashion. In addition, they also have access to modern telecommunication technology such as satellite phones and radios that enable them to operate over vast areas and to also influence events internationally. Unfortunately, the reality is that modern conflict also has a propensity to stalemate. As has been demonstrated by World War I and the Iran-Iraq War, there is an enormous defensive advantage created by small arms and light weapons, modern infantry weapons. The problem is, of course, that they can be overcome by modern tactics and more sophisticated weapons, but it's hard to master these modern tactics, and it's hard to operate and maintain sophisticated weapons that mitigate this defensive advantage that small arms and light weapons give. Lastly, most conflicts that we are concerned about and that are being targeted by arms embargoes occur in weak states that lack both an effective army and the political institutions to effectively combat insurgencies. As I mentioned before, insurgencies need not be large and have multiple potential targets, so it's very easy for them to continue to influence the political dynamics in a conflict area. And unfortunately, this is the case in many African conflicts. Now, one of the most surprising findings of my study was that the international community, as well as a number of scholars, rely on a relatively simple and logical, some would even call the logic impeccable, theory of how arms embargoes work. But I would argue that this theory is rarely analyzed. Now, the theory, simply put, argues that if the international community imposes an effective arms embargo, that would reduce the supply of arms to combatants, meaning that they would have less arms to fight with. This would then result in less fighting, and this would, of course, lead to peace, or at the very least, less destruction. However, I would argue that this theory rests on three flawed assumptions. The first assumption is whether or not the UN can impose an entirely effective arms embargo. I argue that it is not really possible to reduce the flow of arms to a point where fighting is untenable. To some degree, it is analogous to the U.S. war on drugs. even if you dedicate lots and lots of resources to preventing the supply of a good that certain people want, there are usually businessmen and ways to evade the arms embargo. Stopping the flow of arms is extremely difficult. The United States couldn't stop the resupply of the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, or currently stop Iraqi insurgents from being resupplied from Syria or Iran. In addition, frequently there are substantial stockpiles of arms in embargoed conflicts already, which make it obviously very difficult to limit the supply of arms to combatants. I would also argue that the United Nations has problems with monitoring and enforcement of arms embargoes. First of all, the United Nations has limited resources to dedicate to monitoring and enforcement of arms embargoes. There are also institutional hurdles. Frequently, the UN lacks the expertise to effectively monitor arms embargoes. Oftentimes, UN agencies work at cross purposes, and often these agencies also do not share information amongst themselves about potential arms embargo violations or how they could be better enforced. Perhaps most importantly, there's often also a lack of political will to enforce arms embargoes. Secondly, another flawed assumption I would argue is the assumption that fewer and less sophisticated weapons necessarily result in less death and destruction. I would say that one infamous case in point is the Rwandan genocide, when more than 800 people were killed, mostly by people armed with machetes. Furthermore, arms embargoes also change supply patterns. What happens is that arms embargoes tend to actually effectively stop the supply of sophisticated weapons much easier or much better than relatively less sophisticated weapons such as small arms and light weapons. But it's in fact these weapons that lead to stalemate, less need for hierarchy and discipline, and more chaotic fighting. A recent example is the fighting in the eastern DRC, where you see multiple but poorly disciplined fractions fighting each other with small arms and light weapons, and the resulting fighting has triggered a humanitarian catastrophe that is unmatched in the rest of the international community. In addition, I would argue the last flawed assumption is it is unclear how arms embargoes will help change the political calculations of combatants. Conflict resolution theory focuses on this notion of a herding stalemate and that creating the political space for the combatants to try to agree to a negotiated compromise. But of course the question is, who is the stalemate hurting? In many conflicts in which arms embargoes have been imposed, the stalemate is not hurting the combatants, rather it's hurting the civilians present in the conflict areas. In fact, research by Dr. Zartman, the person who actually originated this notion of mutually hurting stalemates, suggests that successful negotiation requires escalation, not de-escalation of conflict. So therefore he argues that in fact conflicts that are not treated early require a high level of intensity before armed groups recognize they are in a mutually hurting stalemate and meaningful negotiations can begin. This runs counter, of course, to the assumptions of what I call current sanctions theory. Now, what I argued are the impacts of arms embargoes. One of my findings was that actually impartial arms embargoes generally tend to prolong conflict. The statistical analysis that I carried out suggests that arms embargoed conflicts last on average 17% longer than non-embargoed conflicts. This would mean that an arms embargo on average increases the length of civil wars by 14 months. This is a statistically significant finding. And in fact, I would argue that this underestimates the effect of an arms embargo because many conflicts that are considered in the data set that I have are very short ones, and so they tend to it tends to actually underestimate how long civil conflicts last. Furthermore, my case study research demonstrates that most armed embargo conflict end when there's either a formal or a de facto arms embargo that shifts the military balance. This applies to Bosnia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. It also applies to Angola when the arms embargo was imposed on UNITA, and in Rwanda, and I would argue also possibly in the DRC. Of course, now that seems to be unraveling, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. Another important impact of arms embargoes, and I apologize for the small graph, I thought the projection would be a little bit larger, is the importance of impartial versus partial arms embargoes. I would argue that the important impact of an arms embargo is that it can disproportionately affect the relative supply of arms, and that this then has an impact on the relative military power of the different groups fighting the conflict, and that this can in fact have an important impact on the military dynamics on the ground. War termination literature is clear that often it is only when the military dynamics change that the different sides appear to be willing to negotiate meaningfully. As Richard Holbrooke once said, the shape of the diplomatic landscape will usually reflect the actual balances of forces on the ground. In concrete terms, this means that as diplomats we could not expect the Serbs to be conciliatory at the negotiating table as long as they had experienced nothing but success on the battlefield. Lastly, I also argue that arms embargoes have important unintended consequences. Oftentimes, arms embargoes can strengthen the aggressor, who already have established arms supply routes. This happened, for example, in the instance of the Bosnian Serbs in Bosnia. I would argue this is also the case with Charles Taylor in Liberia. Secondly, arms embargoes can also lead to a proliferation of factions. Because the arms embargo induces a stalemate, a relatively rough military balance between the different factions, this increases the propensity for groups to splinter. And of course that leads to the proliferation of smaller, undisciplined factions. This can make it much more challenging to mount humanitarian operations, and of course it can also make it much more difficult to engage in mediation and peace negotiations, as there are too many actors to meaningfully deal with. As I've also mentioned before briefly, arms embargoes also impact the type of weapons that are seen in the battlefield that has been embargoed. Generally what happens is that arms embargoes tend to prevent the resupply of sophisticated weapons, but don't catch as much of the small arms and light weapons trade. And of course this is an important impact on the type of fighting that one sees on the ground, and oftentimes leads to more chaotic fighting and the concomitant human rights abuses that one sees in conflict characterized by the prevalence of small arms and light weapons. Lastly, I would argue that arms embargoes and other sanctions can also exacerbate tendencies toward criminalization and co-option of the different combatants. This can empower a criminal elite, which has consequences both during the war, when of course many can profit from continued conflict, and also in post-conflict reconstruction, when those elites become the new political upper class. Now I'll try to be brief, but I'd like to discuss a number of case studies that I did have in my dissertation. One of them is Bosnia, which is actually the only case of when an arms embargo was imposed before fighting actually broke out. The arms embargo, however, did not prevent the outbreak of the fighting in April of 1992. This was, of course, a result of the fact that there were huge quantities of weapons already on the ground. According to Martin Spiegel, the former commander of the 5th Army of the Yugoslav National Army, the former Yugoslavia had some 3.5 million modern infantry arms, about 11,000 large caliber artillery pieces, and about 3,500 tanks stored in depots around the country. In addition, he claims that there was a sufficient quantity of ammunition and other so-called consumables in depots spread throughout the country for 2 years of intensive warfare. The arms embargo also led to an initial Serb advantage vis-a-vis the Bosnian Muslim government. This allowed the Serbs to quickly advance and conquer huge parts of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the process generating huge numbers of human rights violations and other atrocities. This, of course, led to increased UN pressure on the Serbs. So, for example, by May 1992, only a month after the start of the war, the Security Council imposed economic and other sanctions both on Serbia and Macedonia. And 6 months later, it imposed a no-fly zone on all airspace over Bosnia and Herzegovina, which only disadvantaged the Bosnian Serbs because they were the only ones with an air force. Serb overextension and the actions by international actors basically led to a strategic stalemate that lasted for almost 2 to 3 years. According to the Bosnian government general Jovan Divjak, by the end of 1992, according to him, many fronts of the war had taken on the form of a classic World War I trench warfare. However, what happened over time was the United Nations increasingly ignored Bosnian Muslim violations of the arms embargo. And I would argue that these arms embargo violations, both in Bosnia and in Croatia, as well as the military improvements of the Bosnian government, led to a change in the military balance. And by 1995, the Bosnian Muslim Army was threatening Banja Luka, the principal Serb-held city in Bosnia. This forced the Bosnian Serbs to meaningfully negotiate. And at the same time, the United States, which had enormous power over the Bosnian government because it, to some degree, helped facilitate violations of the arms embargo, was able to put pressure on the Bosnian Muslim government to negotiate, and this led to the Dayton Peace Accords. Another case study that I looked into in depth was Liberia. Liberia is a different case because the arms embargo was only imposed after the conflict had already broken out. And I would argue that the arms embargo was not enforced meaningfully, at least until 2001. Now, in the case of the conflict in Liberia, Charles Taylor, whom we all know, led an initial incursion into Liberia that quickly advanced and by mid-1990s was threatening Monrovia. His advance was only stopped by a military intervention of regional states called ECOMOG. The ECOMOG intervention did stop Taylor's advances, but it did nothing to prevent him from consolidating his hold in power in the Liberian hinterland. And so he was actually able to increase his military strength and try to retake Monrovia in what was called Operation Octopus in 1992. This led to the near capture of Monrovia, and it was only stopped by increased reinforcements by ECOMOG and the imposition of an international arms embargo. At this time, ECOMOG naval forces blocked all the Liberian ports and also the international airport, and this precipitated a very significant decline in supply to Taylor. Unfortunately, of course, this was only a temporary decline, and Taylor was able to reestablish lines of supply from alternative sources and was able to sustain his military potential. I would argue that the factors that undermined the arms embargo in Liberia were regional rivalries, the presence of natural resources, and corruption, both regional and within ECOMOG. ECOMOG, of course, was famously known as every car must go by the people in Liberia for its corrupt activities. This unfortunately meant that there was a stalemate that lasted for another 2 or 3 years. That stalemate was not changed until the president, or when President Babangida of Nigeria was replaced by Sani Abacha, who was willing to pursue a much more conciliatory negotiating posture with President Taylor, or with Charles Taylor at that time. What that meant was that there was a political agreement that would allow for elections that Taylor was bound to win. And in fact, in 1997, Charles Taylor won the presidency in UN-sponsored elections. Unfortunately, the elections did not stop the conflict, and fighting soon broke out again in 1999 when 2 new rebel groups manifested themselves, the LURD and MODEL. And importantly, of course, was that LURD was to some degree sponsored by forces in Guinea, and MODEL was sponsored by forces in Côte d'Ivoire. I would argue that one of the reasons that LURD and MODEL were so successful is because the excuse me, the arms embargo that had been imposed in Liberia in 1992 was only de facto enforced against Taylor from about 2001 on. And if you go through the UN panel reports, so the UN panel of experts on Liberia, you will note that continually the panel experts complain about the fact that LURD and MODEL continue to be resupplied by neighboring states. But unsurprisingly or surprisingly, the UN Security Council fails to take action on those allegations and in fact only increases pressure on Taylor. Of course, that may be considered to be a good thing because Taylor only goes into exile once LURD and MODEL are on the outskirts of Monrovia. And that, of course, helps end the war and has helped to stabilize Liberia, at least up until this point. Very briefly, there's a very similar dynamic in Somalia, except for the fact that the embargo is impartial. The arms embargo was also imposed on Somalia after the outbreak of the civil war, and when there was a huge quantity of weapons already in Somalia and more readily available across the border in Ethiopia, which was just emerging from its own civil war. The United Nations Security Council imposed an arms embargo in 1992 after the fall of the central government in Mogadishu, but did very little to impose or to monitor and enforce the arms embargo until 2002. In addition, there were a number of factors that helped undermine the arms embargo. And I should note, though, that one of the important dynamics, of course, in Somalia is that most of these factions actually really don't need a lot of weapons either. So it's a double problem in that, first of all, the arms embargo is not enforced effectively, and second of all, even if it was enforced, the different forces really require very little in terms of weapons. As I mentioned, of course, that there has been a notable absence of enforcement of the arms embargo on Somalia. I was fortunate enough to be a member of the first panel of experts on Somalia in 2002 when we noted the activities of regional states in aiding the different factions. Those tendencies have been noted in every single UN panel report since then. Yet, as we speak, nothing has been done to censure regional states for their activities. In addition, there's a private regional arms market that's very robust. What we found, and certainly what my researchers continue to find, is that it is very easy to source weapons from neighboring states, such as Yemen, that have very lax arms laws, and it's quite easy to transport weapons from Yemen across the Gulf of Aden into Somalia. Interestingly enough, though, it does present, or it does create a price premium. It's not something that I have a slide on, but weapons are in fact about 30% more expensive in Mogadishu than they are in Yemen. So some of the arguments that an arms embargo can impose some costs are relevant, but the question, of course, is are those costs sufficient to change the behavior of the different combatants? Lastly, of course, there's the rise of the Council of Islamic Courts and the global war on terror, which has significantly changed the dynamics on the ground in the Horn and has made it very difficult for the United Nations Security Council to achieve consensus on what to do in Somalia, and particularly how to force regional actors to adhere to the arms embargo. And also quickly, of course, there are many of these very common what I call perverse and unintended consequences of the arms embargo also present in Somalia, namely stalemate and prolongation of the war. Obviously, this war has been going on for at least 15 years. Some would argue for much longer than that, depending on when you wanted to argue the civil war started in Somalia. You have a huge proliferation of factions operating in Somalia that's made negotiating a peace treaty extremely difficult. And of course, you have the criminalization and co-optation of the different warlords, both in an attempt to obtain weapons privately by raising money, and by or through regional sponsors, who then obviously have leverage over those different actors. In conclusion, I would argue that the apparent failure of arms embargoes to end conflict has led some scholars to argue that they are either irrelevant or a convenient excuse for inaction. However, I argue that that's not entirely correct. Arms embargoes do have an impact. They do reduce the flow of arms, but what is more important is that is the relative supply of weapons, which is why I argue that impartial arms embargoes can prolong conflict, because essentially what they do is they reduce the supply of weapons to all sides the same amount, and thus they don't impact the political dynamics on the ground, or I should say the military dynamics on the ground. And if they don't impact the military dynamics, they have very little impact on the political calculations. I would argue, therefore, that a partial arms embargo can perhaps help change the military balance on the ground, and thus change the political calculations of the different actors. The problem, of course, is that the Security Council in general underestimates the difficulty of influencing a modern conflict. As I've mentioned before, as the intended goals of arms embargoes increases, so does the difficulty of changing the political behavior of the actors. Containment is less difficult than deterrence. Deterrence is less difficult than compellence. Establishing peace is the most difficult goal of all. Therefore, I would argue that there is a need for a more comprehensive and strategic approach to try to address these kinds of crises. As General Sir Rupert Smith, a former UN commander in Bosnia, noted, quote, "The starting point to understanding all operations in the Balkans in the 1990s was that they were without strategies. Each event was a function of the one preceding it, rather than part of a plan in it to try to address the underlying conflict." I argue that an arms embargo can be part of a strategy to end a conflict, but it needs to be part of a comprehensive plan to achieve peace. This may require a range of sanctions and the use of military force. But absent more forceful measures, the UN, the arms embargo is not going to be very helpful. If only an arms embargo is a politically acceptable solution, then I argue the United Nations may need to choose sides in an attempt to try to influence the military dynamics on the ground. Furthermore, enforcement, while it is necessary, is not sufficient. It cannot stop all the supply of arms. Thus, relative supply is the most important. And again, I go back to my argument that the international community may want to choose sides. Therefore, I argue that there is a role for both the Secretary General and the UN Secretariat when it comes to the discussions about whether or not arms embargo should be imposed, because I believe that it should be the Secretary General and the UN Secretariat that are providing input to the Security Council as to how one can address a conflict in a strategic manner, rather than trying to react to day-to-day crises that the Security Council is trying to address. In summary, the arms embargo can be an important, powerful tool for the Security Council for dealing with an humanitarian crisis, but only if the embargoes are an element of a comprehensive strategy that realistically appraises the difficulty of promoting peace. If implemented poorly or without careful analysis, arms embargoes may often do more harm than good. It should be emphasized that an impartial arms embargo will rarely have the positive effect unless it is augmented by other forceful measures such as military intervention. If the international community is unwilling to consider the use of force, the most appropriate policy option would be to impose partial arms embargoes that would change the military balance on the ground. Furthermore, I would argue a partial arms embargo can also be used as a carrot as well as a stick. Thus, UN support should be conditioned on adherence to international humanitarian law and a willing to compromise when opponents want peace. And I'll stop it at that and open up for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, EJ. I found that fascinating. I happen to be one of those who have often wondered if a disproportionate amount of energy was being expended by elements of the diplomatic community trying to develop arms embargoes. Because at least in my experience, if people want to fight, they're going to figure a way to get the weapons. But the bigger diplomatic problem is that to the extent that people think they're building a solution, it may be a diversion from more effective, more meaningful forms of diplomatic or military intervention. So it just is in a broad brush. It seems to me that a lot of what you've come up with sort of would reinforce at least a healthier degree of skepticism about where we put our resources, whether behind arms embargoes or other strategies in the event of conflict. But let's open it up for questions. Deidre, back there. Okay, identify yourself and your affiliation, please.
My name is Deirdre Lepin, and I'm currently a fellow here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for a very illuminating talk. I wondered if you'd had a chance to look at the commercial side of the arms embargo. In other words, the illicit flows of arms and how that can be tackled directly, because there are legitimate suppliers of arms, but their supply chain may become very illegitimate. And there are also illicit suppliers of arms. In addition to that, you mentioned corruption as a key issue. Even if you applied a partial arms embargo, it seems to me that to some extent those who are receiving arms in some of the cases are likely to be selling or passing their arms to the other side. I mean, that's part of the commerce that's likely to occur. You mentioned ECOMOG. That took place in Liberia. So that's my question. And as for the Somalia conflict, I mean, the bombing of Hargeisa, which really officially started that conflict, was in May of 1988, so it's been going on for 20 years. But in fact, it was an outgrowth of the Somali national movement that was fighting for the liberation of Hargeisa, which had been going on for at least 10 years before that. So it's a very long-standing conflict, and it's almost a way of life now. So
let's take a few questions and.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I'm Eric Nelson at Nathan Associates. The first time I arrived in Bujumbura in Burundi, I arrived on a smuggler's plane. And at the hotel, there was a sign up saying that the new Beaujolais had arrived. So I think that embargoes are very easy to violate in general. I agree with your terms about embargoes alone. What I have trouble distinguishing in your presentation, I wish you could draw this out a little bit more, is the examples you have raised have been not just an embargo in the pure sense. Maybe there are very few of those, but it's been an embargo coupled with some military intervention, whether it's ECOMOG or a UN security force that comes in either to maintain the peace or establish it. And I'd be very interested in seeing if you can distinguish the effect of the embargo from the effect of these other operations.
Another question? Right there.
Hi, I'm Scott Stedgen with Oxfam. My question is about, it's kind of testing the impartial arms embargo issue, that the partial arms embargo might be more effective than the impartial arms embargo. If the UN would ever, I mean, just going down to practical level, UN would impose a partial arms embargo. I find it very difficult to imagine them imposing an arms embargo on a state but allowing a non-state actor in an internal conflict to receive weapons all they want, because there's lots of dialogue all the time at the UN about blanket bans on transfers to non-state actors. So if they would choose side, would they all, because it's a club of states and the way the UN works, would they always be choosing the state in an internal conflict when the state might not be the legitimate, the one side that they should be picking?
Take those three.
Well, I'll try to address them in order, and if I miss something, just, it's a small enough group that you can pipe up again. I agree with Somalia, and this is one of the reasons that I didn't want to get into when exactly the war in Somalia started, because you can go back to the colonial times when they were struggling against British or Italian oppression. But obviously, it is a conflict that's been going on for quite some time, and that's part of the problem. Of course, is that there are ties to regional states that harken back to the Cold War and so forth that make it very, very difficult to address some of these issues. As to the commercial and illicit side, one of the arguments that I make that's not very popular is that I think the international community in general tends to overstate the role of the private sector in the arms trade. And the reason I make this argument is because I believe that the private arms trade would be significantly constrained were it not for the fact that that trade is facilitated by state actors. And what I mean by that, and sometimes this is in the guise of corruption that you've mentioned, but oftentimes it's in the guise of geopolitical policies. So frequently what you see, so for example in the case of Liberia, many times the panel or media stories would focus on the role of private actors in arming Taylor. But invariably that would be through Cote d'Ivoire or Burkina Faso or some other neighboring state. And I would argue those neighboring states knew that that trade was going on. I mean, certainly it is possible that one or two shipments occur illicitly and that is not controlled or that's uncontrollable. And you know, again, one of the arguments that I'm trying to make and that I'm trying to be very careful about is that it's impossible to stop all weapons from going into a conflict, which is one of the reasons that I focus ad nauseum on what I call the relative supply of weapons. So I'm not saying that Group A is not going to get any weapons, but the problem is, of course, is that if both Group A and both Group B get a limited supply of weapons, that's not going to change the military dynamics because essentially they still have the same relative amount of arms. And so when they're fighting each other, they're still equally powerful. So what I argue is more helpful if, in fact, you cannot stop the trade completely, is to try to change the relative supply. And if you change the relative supply, I would argue what you do is you change the relative balance of military power. And that's one way the international community can try to influence events on the ground. Yes?
Can I just follow up? Because you've said that the states are really complicit in this, and I can think of a very recent illustration, which is the ship off the coast of Somalia that was surrounded by the U.S. and other military that was had been hijacked by pirates, and it was discovered that it was loaded with arms destined for southern Sudan that were in fact going to be offloaded in Kenya. So therefore, Kenya was complicit in this because the bills of lading and so on were destined for Kenya. What would the international community be expected to do in such a case?
Well, I mean, that's one of the problems that when I talk about political will, because, I mean, if we talk about that specific case, I would argue it's not just Kenya. I think there's other countries that know about this trade and have either ignored it or have helped facilitate this trade. And we all know who we're talking about. And this is part of the problem of imposing an arms embargo. I mean, I was talking to one of the other people here before the talk. One of the big problems with dealing with the conflict in Darfur is the fact that there are a number of very powerful states that care deeply about what's going on in southern Sudan, and thus trying to have an impact on what arms go to Sudan is confounded to some degree about the policy goals of important states who differ on what should be happening in Sudan. And thus, in the case of southern Sudan, essentially there are countries that want the government of southern Sudan to have a strong military because they have some reservations about how the elections are going to go next year. And that the ability or the ostensible ability of the government of South Sudan to import weapons has prevented the international community from imposing an effective arms embargo on Darfur. I mean, one of the challenges, of course, with Darfur is that the arms embargo has only been imposed on a region in a country. And in fact, it's not illegal for the government of Sudan to import weapons into any other part of Sudan. It's only illegal for them then to bring those weapons from, let's say, Khartoum into Darfur. But they are, of course, expected to adhere on, by that prohibition. Surprisingly, they don't. Yes?
So that's an example of a partial arms embargo, which you were saying would be more effective than a comprehensive arms embargo.
How is it partial?
Because it's only on a region. It's not for the full state.
No, I'm sorry. I must have misspoke. Then when I mean partial, I mean that essentially the international community prevents one side from obtaining weapons while not preventing the other side, right? So you could argue to some degree that this is a partial arms embargo against the Sudanese Liberation Army and its allies, because essentially the Sudanese Liberation Army is prevented from purchasing weapons because it's obviously based in Darfur, but the government of Sudan is not, if you understand what I mean.
Oh, I do.
Okay. Now, well, we can get back into that again. In terms of the question about embargoes and the fact that oftentimes there's lots of different things going on at the same time, I mean, that's part of the problem. I mean, unfortunately, there is no real example of when only an arms embargo was imposed and essentially it's allowed to run its course. And of course, that's also part of the problem that I identify in my study, is that frequently what happens is an arms embargo is imposed as kind of a first-order solution to a humanitarian crisis. The international community then allows the arms embargo to function or not function, as it may be, for a couple of years, till they determine that in fact the arms embargo is really not having the effect that it's supposed to have. And then other measures are implemented in an attempt to try to address the underlying issues that are triggering the humanitarian community. Of course, this is part of the problem with panel work, is what happens with UN panels of experts is they're hired for a 6-month or a year-long mandate. They're then given 6 months or a year to provide a report. It's only once that report is issued to the Sanctions Committee that the Security Council actually is seized with the issue and has to make a determination. And invariably what will happen is, even if the first report makes some, what I would say are helpful suggestions as to what can be done to help improve the situation, they'll generally wait at least another conflict or at least another panel cycle before they actually make a decision. So you have at least maybe at a minimum a year, perhaps even 2 years, before the Security Council acts on that recommendation and tries to implement something more forceful. Now, it's extremely difficult to tease out what the effect of the arms embargo is in conjunction with other international measures. I would argue, and what I argue in the conclusion is that an arms embargo is most effective when it's imposed in conjunction with other forceful international pressure, be it a military, well, I would argue oftentimes it would need to be some kind of humanitarian intervention, but it can also be other sanctions such as targeted economic sanctions, travel bans, etc., etc. But again, what I would argue is necessary is a whole range of policy tools are applied at the same time in an effort, a strategic effort that is, to try to change the political calculations of the actors on the ground. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily very difficult. I think that with some careful analysis by people who know what's happening in a conflict area, it is possible to craft a strategy, a successful strategy for trying to resolve the conflict. The third question was on states, but yeah.
I mean, how would the UN, would they impose a embargo, a partial embargo on a state and allow free flow of weapons openly to a non-state actor? I don't see how that would ever happen in reality.
Well,
the states will sell to non-state actors. Let's say they don't want, they're not, but would it be open to partial embargo saying we're going to allow all the weapons we want to the Justice and Equality Mission in movement in Darfur, but have a strict embargo on the government of Sudan? Never happened because African politics would never allow the non-state actors to be empowered at the expense of states.
No, I mean I totally agree with that, and I mean I'm not trying to set aside all these political difficulties that are entailed by this. All I'm trying to suggest is that if you have a conflict, for example, where it's the government that's being responsible for most of the abuses, and there is actually an insurgency that is the good guys, if that is possible. All I'm trying to suggest is that imposing an arms embargo is not the appropriate solution, or at least not imposing an arms embargo in isolation is the solution. Now, of course, what you could say is that oftentimes what does happen is an arms embargo is imposed, and, well, not oftentimes, but at least in one instance that I can think of, an arms embargo is imposed, but it's really not applied on the insurgency. So, for example, in the case of Rwanda, an arms embargo was imposed on the government, but it really wasn't applied to Ugandan assistance to the Tutsi forces, and that, in fact, arguably, is what ended the genocide. Was when Tutsis took control of Kinshasa, of Kigali.
Same thing in Darfur when no one's pushing Deby too hard on his support for rebel movements in Darfur. The government of Chad, no one, everyone's allowing free flow of weapons from France to Chad, but complaining about China's sales to the government of Sudan.
Well, I mean, I would argue that Darfur is a little bit more complicated because, for one thing, I would argue that the SLA and all the rebel movements don't have their political act together sufficiently, even were they to obtain sufficient weapons to change the military balance on the ground in Darfur.
SLA, no. GEM, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
SLA GEM is just as powerful. I mean, the most powerful actor in the region. SLA Abdul Wahid has no military strength. It's more of a political leadership. Mini Manawi is part of the government, so it is GEM, and GEM is the one that's being supported by that. Yeah, but they're different.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to get into a nitty-gritty discussion about, whether GEM is the most powerful actor there. I mean, last time I spoke to people who cover Darfur closely, my understanding was there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 factions operating in Darfur. All of them, to some degree, were autonomous political actors. And, of course, this is part of the problem that I talk about in terms of proliferation. And when you actually don't have one militarily significant rebel faction that's able to essentially represent the grievances of those disenfranchised people.
Yes, back.
Right. My question to you, like you mentioned, you say that the UN embargo is not effective. Embargo is, sometimes it's not effective. How would you describe an effective army embargo, if you would put it in your own words? And my second question would be, like you said, the flow of arms does not stop when it comes to, because there are neighboring countries that supply arms to certain countries who are in conflict. And you have mentioned that the UN does not do enough to pressurize those neighboring countries. I'm just interested in knowing, like in your research, if you have been able to identify the reasons, because in my understanding, those countries, especially members of the UN Security Councils who are sitting on the table, they're the ones producing weapons. These neighboring countries in Africa do not produce weapons. Did you identify some of those problems where we have the UN does not take appropriate measure, or that's not pressurizing those? They don't pressurize those countries because they are also thinking about their arms market. Do you think that is possible, or it is a possibility?
Well, there's two issues. One is what makes an effective arms embargo, and the other is what drives the political calculations of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And I think to some degree it depends on the intensity of the conflict. So, for example, one conflict that I didn't really deal with was the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia about 4 or 5 years ago, when I do believe that opposition to the imposition of a mandatory arms embargo was driven by economic calculations, some of the P5 members who wanted to sell sophisticated weapon systems both to Eritrea and Ethiopia. I would argue that in most instances of conflicts that I was concerned about, so something like a Somalia or a Liberia or a Sierra Leone, I believe that the amount of arms and the profit that represents is insignificant to large states. But the problem of trying to control that is tied up in this whole notion of, can states legally import weapons? So the reality is that weapons that were being supplied to, let's say, Taylor or even to Somalia, for example, aren't sold with the understanding that they're necessarily going to those countries. They're being sold under the perhaps convenient fiction that they're going to, let's say, Ethiopia or Yemen or Cote d'Ivoire or Guinea, so to speak. But those countries are, in the international system that we've created, allowed to legally import weapons. Then it becomes a question of trying to determine what in fact they are doing with those weapons and whether they are then violating the arms embargo. And that, of course, is something that I've discussed in the presentation. Now, as to your second question, what have been effective arms embargoes? I would argue that, in fact, arms embargoes have been very effective, well, not have been very effective, but have been effective in solving 3 of the case studies that I identify. I would argue that even though there was a blanket arms embargo in Bosnia, I would argue that the fact that it was de facto ignored for the Bosnian Muslim government, or at least, in large part was ignored, helped shift the military balance. I would argue the same thing occurred in Sierra Leone when, in fact, the arms embargo was only opposed against the RUF. And I think that it was significant that that arms embargo against the RUF, in addition to additional pressure against Taylor, in addition to UK forceful intervention, helped end the war in Sierra Leone. Again, I'm not trying to make the argument that arms embargoes necessarily will help solve a conflict, but I argue that they can be an important tool as part of a strategy to help address the conflict. And lastly, again, I would also argue that in the case of Liberia, the arms embargo was effective. I mean, the reality was that the convenient fiction was it was an impartial arms embargo. But if you look at the reports and if you talk to people who were on the ground, the arms embargo was only imposed against Taylor's forces. And it was the fact that that Lurd and Model were able to obtain sufficient quantities of weapons both from Guinea or Cote d'Ivoire, depending on which faction you're talking about. They were actually able to dominate the battlefield and were able to force Taylor into exile.
There has been a lot of effort expended by either the Belgians or the EC, I forget which, at trying to move toward the creation of an international arms convention, small arms convention. That would involve everything from the registration of firearms at the point of manufacture to arranging for the execution or implementation of arms embargoes by having airports policed or patrolled. What's the status of all that? And have you had any opportunity to share this analysis, which I would think would be a bit of a downer for the folks that are investing a lot of effort on the arms embargo side of the equation?
Well, I mean, I think the status is that those talks are ongoing, and I would I would suspect that those talks are going to go on for a long time to be. I'm not intimately familiar with the talk. I must say that personally, I don't see a big problem with trying to at least get a little bit more control over the illicit arms trade. I mean, the illicit arms trade is a problem from a number of perspectives. What I'm trying to look at more carefully is what, in fact, is the Security Council trying to achieve with the imposition of an arms embargo. And what I mean by that is that if there is more transparency about the arms trade, it would certainly make it harder for states to disguise or to use plausible deniability to hide their role in supplying different factions. But it will not necessarily prevent that. So, for example, in the case of Somalia, it's an open secret that Eritrea is supplying fundamentalist forces, and it's an open secret that Ethiopia is supplying the TFG and its allies. But if there is a lack of political will or a lack of a strategy to try to address the underlying reasons for the conflict, the arms embargo is not going to have much of an impact. That's the argument I'm trying to make. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing to control the arms trade. All I'm trying to suggest is that if you do it in a way that makes strategic sense. And that strategy needs to have at least some overarching goal of trying to change the political calculations of the combatants to try to force them to negotiate a meaningful peace. I would argue that, unfortunately, oftentimes that can only really be done by changing the military dynamics on the ground. And if you were going to make that argument, then I would say, well, the only way you're really going to change the military dynamics on the ground is by changing which group is more powerful. And on and on.
I'm Alix Boucher with the Future of Peace Operations program at the Stimson Center. EJ, I had a question for you. I mean, in a lot of the countries you described, the UN is pursuing sort of a multi-pronged approach to addressing these conflicts, right? Whether it's sanctions, whether it's a peace operation, peace-building efforts, the UNDP can be on the ground. How do you, and this is something that, as you know, we've been working on as well, how do you think the UN should think about how it puts all of those efforts together so that, they don't cancel each other out, or the political perceptions of the various players are impacted differently by different actions, whether it's the sanctions or the development efforts. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, let me address that first, because I mean it is something that I struggle with. Well, that I don't struggle with a lot. I mean I think part of the trend within the UN is a recognition that oftentimes the UN works at cross purposes, and this is one of the reasons that you see this push for so-called integrated missions, where at least on the ground you try to subsume all the different UN actors under a special representative or some other UN official, and I think to some degree that's a good trend. I think oftentimes it may be implemented poorly, but in general, I think that it's a wise strategy. But what that fails to recognize is that there may be an actor on the ground who's thinking strategically, but at the level above that, at the international community, there is no strategy. I mean, the reality and the reason I gave that quote from Sir Rupert Smith is the fact that the Security Council, in general, I would argue, and other people can disagree with me, does not think strategically. It is a very reactionary body. And what it does is it's faced with a crisis. You have 15 disparate members trying to come together with some consensus as to what is the most appropriate policy prescription. and of course, what comes into that is political differences, ideological differences as to what are most appropriate policy tools, ideological differences as to whether it's appropriate for the international community to intervene at all. And what often happens is that the lowest common denominator is arrived at, and that is, well, let's impose an arms embargo, and let's see what happens. And then, of course, that arms embargo, I would argue, is oftentimes not even monitored effectively or enforced effectively. So I would argue that if you want it to be much more effective, you need to have a strategy within the international community as to how to do that, which is why I identify a role for the Secretary General and the UN Secretariat. I'm not saying that those are the actors that have to do that, but essentially what I argue is that there needs to be some pushback from some other international organization or agency or whatever that says to the Security Council, okay, you want to intervene in crisis X. It's great that you want to impose an arms embargo, but what exactly are you trying to achieve? And do you really think that the arms embargo in isolation is going to achieve that goal? And again, I would argue, based on my research, that an arms embargo can be helpful, but that the arms embargo by itself is not sufficient to achieve the stated goal of establishing peace and stability in country X, Y, or Z. And again, I'm not trying to say that that an arms embargo is not an effective tool. It can be, but I would just argue that it has to be part of a number of policies that, you know, hopefully again would be implemented in a larger strategy of trying to get the different sides to come to a negotiated compromise rather than to, you know, continued stalemate and continued conflict.
Eric.
Paul Collier and others have found, by looking at many conflicts, that that the probability of going back into conflict after a conflict is resolved depends on several variables, some of which are important and some of which are not. One of the most important ones is if the conflict was ended by victory or by a negotiation. The ones you're talking about have been ended by negotiation, but as you're saying, it's by the international community choosing a side. And so that's, in a way, that's tilting the playing field. Do you think that what we're talking about in terms of ending the negotiation is really tilting the playing field so that one side, although there is a negotiation, one side is actually winning from this extra strength? And if this were not to happen, would we be back in the scene of the old Cold War, war by proxy, where there is no single solution being forced on the outside and the stalemate continues?
Yes. No, I mean the reality is that my research and my conclusions fit in nicely with a number of strains of work on civil conflict, and it's not just Paul Collier. I mean, there's a number of other academics who've looked closely at the success of settlements and what will impact that. And I would argue that, you know, part of what helps drive negotiations in the cases that I studied most in depth is the fact that one side was basically gaining military dominance at the cost of the other side. But, and this is where it's important, and this is actually an important distinction that I go into in more depth in my dissertation, is there comes a point when one has a problem with how the political calculations are impacted. And what I mean by that is that some people argue you help one side militarily, that changes the military calculation for the losers, but it also changes the military calculations for the winners, of course. And what happens frequently is that, you know, you may actually drive the calculations to the point where the winners, so to speak, the current winners, decide, well, we are going to decide this militarily, right? And that's something I actually had to struggle with quite deeply in the dissertation, because there are some people, so for example in Bosnia, who say, or Bosnian Muslims that is, you know, we should have just kept going, okay? And what I think is important is that by helping one side win, or at least start to dominate, you not only change the calculations of the political, the losers, the current losers, so to speak, who are being forced to negotiate because they essentially anticipate that if they don't negotiate now, they're going to be even in a worse position later on, but you also create leverage over those people who are currently winning, because they understand that they are only winning because they have the support in the international community. And in fact, one of the interesting things that I found in my research talking to all these different combatants is that oftentimes those combatants were quite aware of the fact that the support they were getting was provisional, and was provisional on the fact that they, had certain limitations both in terms of their behavior. So, for example, when I interviewed Sekou Kone of the LURD, he knew that if his forces were extremely abusive, that he would lose the support of the international community. And he tried the best he could, and of course this is an imperfect world, but he told me he tried very, very hard to try to control his forces. And I would argue, and Howard could talk about this, that the LURD in general were more disciplined than many of the other factions in Liberia. The same thing in the case with the conflict in Bosnia. The Dayton Peace Accords, both sides were dragged kicking and screaming to Dayton. The Bosnian Serbs had to negotiate because they were losing, but the Bosnian Muslims also had to negotiate because they knew that if they didn't play ball, so to speak, that the United States may actually end their support. And that would obviously have significant forces. And in fact, I go more deeply into it. I mean, there were some things going on at the end of the bombing campaign that suggests that the international community, and by this I really mean the United States, was being relatively sophisticated about sending signals to both sides as to what was acceptable and what was not.
Perhaps I can just tell my little anecdote from my Liberia work. We were asked by the State Department and by the United Nations to launch a program in Liberia of building collaborative capacity, as we did in Burundi and so on, and in Congo. And so we convened just a few weeks after the new government was installed, a workshop with about 37 people that had LURD, Model, Sekou Kone was there, and Charles Taylor's people. We had all these elements, the elected leadership, top civil society, church people, and so on. And very successful workshop. And the third day of the workshop, there was a gunfire heard nearby. And so people got very discombobulated for a moment and started racing to the window to look outside to see what was happening, getting on their cell phones to see if people were okay. At which point, one of our ward, our leaders, may have been Sekou, spoke up and said, "Well, can't be all that serious. We're all here." One of my favorite moments from this work. You had a question here.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Sloboda from Africa Faith and Justice Network. I understand your hypothesis that the UN should come up with an overarching theme that constitute a more comprehensive and strategic policy in terms of arms embargo, that the arms embargo should just be a part of it. In your analysis and your case studies, did you make recommendations as to how any of those could have been done differently, towards the end? Because I see you're making, you're suggesting an alternative, I would say, which it's interesting and should be looked into. But did you present, in one of your case studies, do an analysis of what possibly could have been done differently if they had implemented this overarching theme, perhaps for Liberia or Somalia or any of the different ones?
Unfortunately, no, because that's not proper academic work. But I think the implicit argument usually is that when the international community first attempts to address a humanitarian crisis, it needs to act much more decisively. And again, the one take home that I would that I would like to be taken home is that an arms embargo in isolation is not going to be very helpful. Especially an impartial arms embargo, where the idea is, okay, we just try to deny weapons to all sides, and that will somehow magically result in the end of the conflict. I think that when there is a crisis of this nature, what needs to happen is someone within the UN, probably within the Secretary General's office or within the UN Secretariat, needs to think carefully through what is happening in the region, try to come up with policy options as to how one could address a specific crisis and try to resolve it, and come up with essentially a range of policy tools that can be applied to achieve those aims. I would argue that oftentimes that would include, or that could include, the imposition of an arms embargo, but that would also require other things such as other targeted sanctions, military intervention perhaps, if military intervention is not possible, some other forceful measures, but these need to be all applied at the same time. Because what's happening is again, and as Sir Rupert Smith noted, what frequently happens is it's a piecemeal approach. The first thing that happened, so for example in Bosnia, the first thing that happened was an arms embargo was imposed. Then there was a peacekeeping monitoring mission. Then there was the imposition of economic sanctions on the Bosnian Serbs because they were the aggressors. Then 6 months later it was the imposition of a no-fly zone. Then 6 months after that you create safe havens. And what happens is that by slowly introducing all these forceful measures, you are giving all the different combatants time to strategically react to those measures in an attempt to mitigate the impact of those measures. And if one were to do that all at the same time, it would have much more effect on the political calculations of the actors.
Okay. Any last questions? This has been a fascinating discussion, EJ. I look forward to the final. Well, I guess you have finished
I am finished,
the
yes.
dissertation now, so planning to publish it or
Hopefully, yes.
Great. And I also especially look forward, though, to some diplomatic reactions to the study, because I think it could impact thinking at the UN and elsewhere.
Hopefully.
So thank you all very much for joining with us this morning.